So I can give you an example.
You keep on talking about multivariate analysis.
Let me give you an example.
I'm saying that
And this is fantastic. Peterson asks Newman to wait, and he holds up a finger. He looks away from her as he says this, but Newman continues. So Peterson closes back down, and he waits. And then he shows Newman the behavior that he would like.
I can give you an example. Okay. There's a personality trait.
And this is just gold. Peterson says, let me give you an example. And these are the same words that he's used 40 seconds ago. Only this time, he ends it by saying, okay. Let me give you an example. Is Peterson? Okay. Is what he expects of Newman. Let me give you an example. Okay. Then he licks his lips.
I can give you an example. Okay. There's a personality trait.
And wow, what an interview. Cathy Newman versus Jordan Peterson. A lot of people are seeing it as a battle, as a game. Jordan Peterson himself described it as a dominance hierarchy dispute. And that's how I'm going to treat it for this video. So if we ignore all the politics that are around it, the left versus right, I think if we dive deep into what Jordan Peterson did and how Cathy Newman responded, I think we can learn a lot. We only have Peterson's account of what happened exactly before they moved into the interview.
Well, first in the green room where everything was quite friendly. Cathy was being made up in there, and so we had a pleasant interchange, I would say. And then I was brought into a room where the interview took place with the cameras, and we spoke for 2 or 3 minutes before the cameras rolled, and she was pleasant and engaging, distracted a bit, but it's exactly what you'd expect, right? She's got her mind on many things. But then the cameras went on, and she just was a completely different person instantly. And so that was interesting.
Jordan Peterson, you've said that men need to quote.
So these are the first frames of the interview, and we see Peterson listening to Newman asking a question, then answering the question, and we get this quick shot of the overall studio before it's back to Peterson. When we freeze that studio shot, I noticed that Peterson's body looks relaxed, but his hands look super tight, and the overall picture is not someone who is super relaxed. And it's really worth returning to this shot later in the interview because it shows how much the dynamic changes through small movements of the body.
It's good.
So you say, I mean, that sounds pretty bad. You're saying
It's
there's a
bad.
crisis of masculinity. I mean, what do you do about it?
It's good.
So you say.
This is the first time that Newman interrupts him in the interview, and she does it throughout the interview. She's a really fast interviewer, so as anyone finishes their answer, she's straight in with the next question.
Again, otherwise he'll be shot.
And what about the...
In this case, Peterson pulls his lips together really tight. You know, it's abnormally tight the way he does it. So he closes his lips tight so he doesn't say anything, and he looks directly at Newman.
It's good.
So you say, I mean, that sounds pretty bad.
This is the first time we see Newman, and 2 things stand out strongly. One is her face, which I would call a really face. She's as if she's saying really. We also hear her words, so you're saying, for the first time. But I'd really like you to pay attention to what's happening with her chair. This comes across as really childlike, and for Peterson, it's game on.
It's good.
So you say, I mean, that sounds pretty bad. You're saying
It's
there's a
bad.
crisis.
Peterson interrupts back at Newman, and he's doing it in agreement with what she's saying, to confirm what she's saying. But her reaction is really interesting. This happens so fast.
Saying
It's
there's a
bad.
crisis of masculinity. I mean, what do you do about it?
And just like that, the dominance battle escalates. Let's have another look at what just occurred.
Saying
It's
there's
bad.
a crisis of masculinity. I mean, what do you do about it?
Peterson interrupts Newman with, "It's bad." Newman responds by jutting her head forward a number of times. It's quite an aggressive move, and it reminds me a little bit of how a boxer might shape up to another boxer. Next pattern we see from Newman, we see throughout this interview. She'll have her hand out in front of her as she's ending a question, and as she ends her question, she'll bring that hand close to her body and close herself off. And at the same time, she'll throw her head back in a really extreme tilt. So I'm going to show you an example from later on in the interview so that you can see how it appears to Peterson.
But there's
That
multiple.
exists.
Yeah.
This can be a sign of wariness or suspicion. Right here, it's really difficult for Peterson. Can you imagine trying to convince Newman of anything while she's in this position? It can also be a sign of disbelief or of feeling superior or believing you're superior to whoever you're talking with. I mean, she's literally looking down her nose at him. One thing's for sure, it's a dominance play.
What do you do about it?
You help people understand why it's necessary and important for them to grow up and adopt responsibility.
What do you do about it?
And that's just a look of disappointment.
You
Got to remember that all this is happening in split seconds. So really you would expect Peterson to take stock here. He's gone more inward, he's looking down, but he's brought out a power word of you.
What do you do about it?
you help people understand why
For someone so precise with language, for Peterson to change from you tell to you help really shows a movement from control to encouragement. So he's thinking on the fly. I think all of this is just flowing naturally from him. But the impact on Newman is profound.
it's necessary and important for them to grow up and adopt responsibility.
Wow, just wow. Peterson has withdrawn. He's quite inward. He's looking down, but he uses that power word of you and he speaks downwards. He's not looking at Newman. He even using the word them. He's looking up slightly towards Newman, but it's only when he says the words to grow up and adopt responsibility that he looks directly at Newman. And it's a message for her. You could go frame by frame throughout this whole interview and you'll just see the escalation in dominance and the response. And that's partly what makes this interview so fascinating, is the speed of action. But instead of doing that, let's look at some major patterns. Here we see Peterson early in the relationship responding to interruptions. And he really welcomes the interruptions. He does two things. Firstly, in the first example, he acknowledges the interruption by looking at Newman and answering her question that she's inserted into the conversation.
What's in it for the women, though?
Well, what sort of partner do you want?
In the second interruption, he sees it occurring before it occurs. Obviously, she's giving him some kind of signal through her face or body language, and he nods for her to continue. Now, nodding in this way is very encouraging.
Virtually by definition. So
Let me put a quote to you.
But to be clear, he's being interrupted in both cases.
it's true, but
So Peterson's assertive in very, very small body movements. He's not extending his body in any way to assert dominance by taking up more space. He's not even threatening to encroach into Newman's physical territory. But this changes and he becomes more assertive with the space around him and the strength of his words.
some women get paid more than men.
So you were saying that by and large, okay,
See, because I'm very, very, very careful with my words.
so the pay.
And the interruptions continue. This time when Peterson interrupts Newman, we get a response from Newman that's quite different from Peterson. Peterson, as we've seen, has either nodded or looked at Newman when he's interrupted, but here Newman blocks him with her hand.
But then I want to put to you,
Minorities too dominate.
okay, sure.
minorities and women.
But I want to put to you that here in the UK, for example, let's take that as an example.
Peterson was quite deferential and encouraging at the beginning of the interview, but now he does something that deeply shocks Newman. I'd love to see Peterson and Newman side by side when that happened, but we only have Newman's face.
And the market is dominated by men.
No,
So
it's
what I'm
not. It's
asking you-
not. The market is dominated by.
Then it cuts to Peterson, and we can see he's pointing at Newman, and he said a very strong no at this point of shock. So it's a little bit hard to tell what's going on, but we can say that Peterson is definitely getting more assertive in the conversation.
Okay,
See, because I'm very, very.
And despite this,
very
there are
careful
times
with my
when
words.
Peterson reaches out to Newman, and there's a real chance for them to have a genuine conversation. And here's one example.
so that's the thing. Successful women, I'm not very agreeable.
Right.
But
I've noticed that
successful-
actually in this conversation.
At least
And
And I think he blows this particular opportunity. There's a moment where Newman is really opening up and there's a chance to have dialogue. But I think Peterson is a bit childlike in his response, kind of glee and a kind of gloating, which I think comes back to bite him later on. So by now, Peterson has run a bunch of experiments with Newman, and he has all the tools to win the dominance hierarchy dispute.
Men fighting. I mean,
would
let me
you
just put another thing to you from the book.
Why
You're
wouldn't
saying
you have to
real-
battle for a high-quality position?
Look, some would say that Newman was in a losing position because of the note she had and the approach she had and the ideology that she took into this interview. I argue slightly differently in that I feel it was Peterson's use of laughter at really opportune moments that unlocked the game for him.
Gentleness by implication are not female traits.
No,
I mean,
I'm not
that's very
saying that.
dangerous
I'm
territory.
not saying that at all.
It's an example of how he changed his behaviour throughout the interview, and he learnt what worked with Newman and he exploited it for the game.
Why
Well,
should
that's
your...
what they said it was designed to do.
Okay, you cited...
And laughter was the key. And this whole sequence is where Peterson wins and where he loses. Because he has an opportunity in this sequence to take the conversation in a different pathway, and he fails. But it's a really great sequence, so let's take a look at what might not be so obvious on first viewing. Peterson completely changes the dynamic. We're used to Newman asking Peterson a question as soon as he's finishing his statement, or as he's just about to finish his statement. But here, he takes a big drink of water as she begins her question. And this signals to Newman that Peterson's attention is not fully on her. But what he does next takes it to another level.
Reasonable period of time, but not, certainly not for centuries.
Let me move on to another debate that's been very controversial for you.
And Peterson smirks when he hears controversial.
And this is, you got in trouble for refusing to...
Look where Peterson is. He's almost horizontal. He's below Newman's eye level. And she's tidying her papers. This is the long shot from the very beginning of the interview. And you can see Peterson is leaning back, but it's acceptable. Probably the closest scenario I can think of is a job interview. And if he was in a job interview situation, his posture is acceptable and it's showing respect. But later on, at this really critical point in the exchange, it's not acceptable. He started to step outside the rules and he's signalling to Newman that he's not going to play by these rules. Now she responds by tidying her papers. She's making them neat in a way that she can't do with Peterson directly. And I think at this stage it's really important to note that the rules for men and women are really different. Typically you would not see a woman do this kind of behaviour, to lean right back like that. It would be seen as very disrespectful. Now Peterson has done it and he's not playing by Newman's rules. Then we get the smirk and the block.
Why should
that's
your...
what they said it was designed to do.
Okay, you cited freedom of speech in that. Why should your right to freedom of speech trump a trans person's right not to be offended?
Because in order to be able to think, you have to risk being offensive. I mean, look at the conversation we're having right now. Like you're certainly willing to risk offending me in the pursuit of truth. Why should you have the right to do that? It's been rather uncomfortable.
Well, I'm very glad I put you on the spot.
Well,
I'm very glad that I have
but you get
exercised my freedom of
point.
speech.
You get my point. It's like you're doing what you should do, which is digging a bit to see what the hell's going on.
So
And that is what you should do. But
and
you're
you
exercising
see-
your freedom of speech to certainly risk offending me. And that's fine. I think more power to you as far as I'm concerned.
So you haven't sat there and... I'm just trying to work that out. I mean,
Ha, gotcha.
you have got me. You have got me. I'm trying to work
about
that through in
time.
my head. Yeah, it took a while.
It did, yeah.
Took a while. Why should
that's
your...
what they said it was designed to do.
Okay, you cited freedom of speech in
Newman doesn't look at her notes, so this question seems to come out of nowhere.
that. Why should your right to freedom of speech trump a trans person's right not to be offended?
She looks down her nose at him as if she hasn't asked that question, but her hands give her away. Check.
Because in order to be able to think, you have to risk being offensive. I mean, look at the conversation we're having right now. You know, like you're certainly willing to risk offending me in the pursuit of truth. Why should you have the right to do that? It's been rather uncomfortable.
And this smirk, it's really childlike. Just as Newman's swiveling in her chair was childlike, so too is this smirk from Peterson. And again, it's very confronting.
I'm very glad I put you on the spot.
Peterson's laughter takes all the air out of Newman, completely distracts her from where her view was, which was down at her notes.
Well,
I'm very glad that I have exercised my freedom of speech.
I can't help but think of this moment as like a dance. Earlier in the interview, Peterson was deferring to Newman, but he's learnt how she acts and he mirrors her behaviour almost perfectly. I just think he's training her. Right now, as he leans back, it's almost like he could lift his chin and look down his nose at her, but he doesn't. He keeps his head level, and he also has a glass in his hand, just as she has notes, so there's a whole bunch of things happening in a really short period of time here.
You get my point. It's like you're...
And as he says, you get my point, Newman preens herself. She straightens her skirt. Now, there's a few ways of interpreting this. One is attraction, to say that Newman might be attracted to Peterson. Another one is to say that she is sort of keeping creepy eyes away from her. But the way I view it is more that she's cleaning herself, like brushing the dirt off herself.
You get my point. It's like you're doing what you should do, which is digging a bit to see what the hell's going on.
So
and that is what you should do. But you're exercising your freedom of speech to certainly risk offending me. And that's fine. I think more power to you as far as I'm concerned.
So you haven't sat there and...
Eyes up, she's searching for something, and the breath out tells you she's got nothing.
I'm just trying to work that out. I mean...
Ha, gotcha.
Right now, Peterson is a jerk. He's got her to this position by using laughter. So to say, ha, gotcha, is, I don't know, it's just beyond the game.
You have got me. I'm trying to work that through in my head. Yeah.
And this is really painful for me to watch. There's no joy in this for me. Because even though Newman is smiling here, you know, she's severely under stress. This is not a good situation for her. And Peterson has the opportunity at this point in time to take the conversation in a different direction. Now, Newman does too, so no, I'm not taking away her responsibility.
Took a while.
It did.
But Peterson gloats. He's gloating at this point, and unfortunately, Newman goes back into portrayal, and we're back in that same sort of dynamic that we had earlier, which is just mind-boggling to me. It's like having someone in checkmate, stepping away from the chessboard to find that they've put all their pieces back in place and the game is back on. Hey, and it's important to note there are actually 4 dominant forces in this dispute. There's obviously Peterson and Newman, but what may be less obvious is the editor, or the producer of this video. They've had some really direct influence in the choices they've made over what footage to show. And lastly, the last dominant force in the video is the context or expectation of everyone involved. Jordan Peterson himself said that he did not expect this video to be put on YouTube.
Jordan Peterson, thank you.
My pleasure. Nice talking with you.
In this last shot, we see the 2 participants cut off quite abruptly by the Channel 4 logo, and I can't help but think that this was covering up something that may have been said right at the end of the interview, and it's an example of how Channel 4 producers have really hidden during this interview and afterwards, with the exception of actually putting it on YouTube. For instance, we rarely see Cathy Newman. I had to look through a lot of footage to find the elements where we actually see Cathy Newman. I would love to see her more on camera during this interview because her body language was so revealing. Channel 4 also used zooms and crane positions and table placements and all sorts of stuff that looked like it was there to sabotage Jordan Peterson. And let's bear in mind, they invited him into their studio. Also, since the interview has aired on YouTube, Channel 4 and Cathy Newman have really gone to ground and haven't really released anything meaningful to explain their actions. So I call on Channel 4 to grow up and adopt response. The reason Peterson won, in my view, was not because he won the debate with logic and reason, which he clearly did, but because after this debate he found ways to reflect on his own behaviour, find areas to improve, he shared those with the world and really promoted a culture of learning. And that's something that's really sadly absent from Channel 4 or Cathy Newman's response. What's next? I would love to see Jordan Peterson and Cathy Newman in conversation anywhere but Channel 4.